In 1988, inside a brightly lit American discount store, a shopper reached onto a metal shelf and picked up a compact microwave oven. It was encased in thin, stamped metal and cheap plastic, manufactured overseas and priced to move. On the front control panel, printed in plain lettering, was a single word: Emerson. At that exact moment, across the country, another Emerson product was being carefully preserved. A 1940s Catalin tube radio, glowing with the warmth of vacuum tubes. Built by thousands of workers in a sprawling Jersey City factory. But the microwave on that 1980s retail shelf had not been designed by Emerson engineers. It had not been built in an Emerson plant. The company that once proudly called itself the maker of the biggest-selling little radio in the world no longer manufactured anything in America. The name itself had been stripped of its engineering soul, sold off, and transformed into a hollow licensing badge, slapped onto imported appliances to convince consumers they were still buying a piece of trusted domestic heritage. The consequence of this shift was absolute. The assembly workers who perfected the compact American tabletop radio were gone. The local Main Street service technicians who once repaired them had lost their benches. The American working-class families who had relied on that specific badge for affordable news during the Great Depression were now simply buying a ghost. Decades earlier, that same name had meant precisely the opposite. It was a promise of reception and American industrial access. The paradox is that Emerson did not disappear because America stopped listening. It disappeared because the way America listened, and the way it shopped, had fundamentally changed. But the real story of Emerson Radio is not only the story of a badge on a cheap imported microwave. It is the story of how the American consumer electronics market shifted from a system that rewarded engineering trust to a retail ecosystem that demanded nothing but scale. Every week, we tell the stories of American radios, local stations, and listening habits that shaped how people heard music, news, and memory, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, in New York City, in 1922. In 1922, the American radio market was a chaotic, rapidly expanding frontier, but the men who would eventually dominate its most accessible corners were not initially radio engineers. Benjamin and Max Abrams were businessmen operating out of New York City. That year, they took over the name and assets of the Emerson Phonograph Company. The original company had built its reputation on mechanical record players, but the Abrams brothers recognized that the physical spinning disc was already facing a lethal threat from the invisible broadcast signals moving through the air. They pivoted the company toward radio, entering an industry that was defining the sound of the modern American living room. But in the 1920s, a radio was not a casual purchase. It was a massive, imposing piece of furniture. Early receivers were built around large vacuum tubes, glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals that generated intense heat and required enormous power supplies. These circuits demanded heavy transformers, large tuning capacitors, and extensive internal wiring. To house this complex, fragile architecture, manufacturers built giant wooden consoles and towering cathedral cabinets. These sets sat in the center of the living room, commanding attention and demanding a premium price. A quality console radio from a major brand could easily cost over $100, which in the 1920s represented a staggering investment for a working-class household. The industry had convinced itself that the American listener wanted a radio that doubled as fine mahogany cabinetry. The Abrams brothers saw a different reality. They realized that the physical size of the radio was not a feature, it was a barrier. The true American absence was not a lack of broadcasting, but a lack of access. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, ushering in the Great Depression, the economic reality of the American household fundamentally changed. Disposable income vanished. Millions of families were terrified, isolated, and desperate for the free news, weather, and entertainment that broadcast stations provided. Yet the radio industry was still trying to sell them expensive wooden furniture. The working-class family in a cramped Brooklyn apartment or a dusty Midwestern farmhouse did not need a piece of mahogany. They simply needed a voice in the room, and they needed it at a price they could actually afford. The American entry point that changed the trajectory of the company arrived in 1932. Emerson introduced the Model 25, quickly dubbed the Pee Wee radio. It was a radical departure from the industry standard. Measuring barely 10 inches across and weighing just over 6 pounds, the Model 25 was small enough to hold in one hand. It did not require a dedicated corner of the living room. It could sit perfectly on a crowded kitchen counter, a bedside table, or a narrow shelf. More importantly, it retailed for roughly $25. This dramatic reduction in size and cost was not magic. It was the result of the universal AC/DC chassis, a circuit design that cleverly eliminated the heavy, expensive power transformer. By stringing the tube heaters in a series circuit and running directly off the wall voltage, the radio became vastly lighter, cheaper to manufacture, and capable of operating on either alternating or direct electrical current, which was vital in an era when many American cities still had mixed electrical grids. The early reception to the Pee Wee radio was instantaneous and overwhelming. Industry records suggest that Emerson simply could not build the Model 25 fast enough. Retailers who had previously struggled to finance expensive console sales during the Depression found that the compact Emerson practically sold itself. The distribution channel shifted. These radios did not need to be displayed in hushed, velvet-lined music salons. They were stacked in local hardware stores, neighborhood pharmacies, and independent Main Street electronics shops. By 1934, industry estimates suggest Emerson was manufacturing over 1,000 compact sets a day. The radio had been transformed from a family heirloom into a personal appliance. But this sudden, massive success did not secure the company's future. It entirely rewrote the rules of survival. By proving that a small, $25 radio could dominate the market, Emerson had triggered a dangerous new reality for its own assembly lines. The company was now locked into the brutal mathematics of Force 1, American cabinet, tube, component, and labor costs. While the AC/DC chassis was cheaper to build, the raw materials, vacuum tubes, tuning dials, copper wire, stamped metal chassis, and wooden or early plastic cabinets still required thousands of American workers to assemble, solder, and test. By lowering the retail price to the floor, Emerson had slashed its profit margin per unit to pennies. A premium manufacturer could survive by selling a few thousand expensive consoles a month. Emerson could only survive by selling hundreds of thousands of compacts. They had captured the working-class American kitchen, but to keep it, the factory could never stop scaling. The Pee Wee radio proved that America wanted a set in every room, but that same success locked the company into a brutal cycle. To survive the new mass market they had just created, the assembly line could never, ever stop moving. To conquer the American home, Emerson could not simply rely on a clever, transformer-less circuit. The Model 25 Pee Wee had proven that working-class families wanted a small radio, but its early wooden cabinet still looked like a shrunken piece of living room furniture. If Emerson was going to put a radio in the kitchen, the bedroom, and the garage, the radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, had to stop looking like a mahogany heirloom and start looking like a modern appliance. The breakthrough came through a radical shift in manufacturing materials. In the early 1930s, the radio industry had begun experimenting with bakelite, an early hard plastic used for many radio cabinets, which was strong and moldable, but visually dark and industrial. Emerson engineers realized that dark brown and black boxes would not appeal to a housewife decorating a brightly lit kitchen or a bright suburban bedroom. They needed color. The solution was Catalin. Unlike bakelite, Catalin was a cast phenolic resin that could be produced in brilliant, translucent colors mimicking jade, alabaster, lapis lazuli, and onyx. It was poured into lead molds, cured in massive ovens, and then polished to a deep gem-like luster. By adopting Catalin, Emerson transformed the tabletop radio, a radio designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, from a utilitarian box into an object of intense visual desire. But wrapping a radio in thick plastic created a dangerous engineering paradox. Vacuum tubes generate intense, continuous heat. Stuffing 5 hot tubes into a tiny, sealed Catalin box was a recipe for melted plastic, scorched wires, and electrical fires. Emerson engineers had to design a highly specific chassis layout, utilizing strategic heat shielding and precise ventilation slots cut into the cabinet backing. They adopted the emerging All-American 5-tube configuration, a standardized superheterodyne circuit. This design mixed the incoming broadcast with a local signal to vastly improve selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, while using the minimum number of tubes required to pull a clear AM signal out of the static. This engineering balancing act meant that a teenager could sit in a cramped bedroom, dial in a distant baseball game on a warm summer night, and safely leave the radio running for hours. The radio would grow warm to the touch, but it would not fail. To completely break the radio out of the traditional electronics aisle, Emerson executed a masterstroke of marketing. In 1933, Benjamin Abrams secured a licensing deal with Walt Disney to produce the Mickey Mouse radio. Featuring a repoussé metal panel of the famous mouse, it was an instant sensation. But the true design peak arrived in 1940 with the Emerson Patriot. Designed by legendary American industrial designer Norman Bell Geddes, the Patriot was molded in bold Catalin colors, mostly patriotic red, white, and blue. Its grille, the opening or fabric-covered area through which sound leaves the radio cabinet, was shaped like a stylized American flag, with stars serving as the speaker cutouts. The tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, was large, round, and seamlessly integrated into the handle. Priced between $15 and $20, it was cheap enough for a factory worker to buy on a Friday payday, but striking enough to sit on the vanity table of a wealthy suburban home. This combination of brilliant color, compact size, and reliable AM reception triggered a distribution breakthrough that forever changed American retail. Before the Catalin Emersons, a family bought a radio at a dedicated music salon or a specialized Main Street electronics shop. The radio was sold alongside pianos and phonographs. Emerson bypassed this bottleneck entirely, because the Catalin radios looked like polished gemstones. Emerson sales representatives convinced neighborhood jewelry stores to stock them in their display windows. A husband shopping for a Christmas gift could buy a ruby-red Emerson radio right next to a silver necklace. The radios were suddenly everywhere. They were stacked near the registers of local Main Street pharmacies. They appeared in the dense, text-heavy pages of Sears and Montgomery Ward mail-order catalogs. They were sold in neighborhood hardware stores, heavily promoted in large department stores like Macy's, and proudly displayed in corner drugstores across the Midwest. By pushing the radio into these non-traditional retail spaces, Emerson built an impenetrable American radio moat. Competitors who only sold through authorized appliance dealers simply could not match Emerson's physical footprint. If a shopper walked down any commercial street in America in 1940, they would see an Emerson radio in a window. The company had successfully reframed the fundamental nature of the product. It was no longer a major household investment. It was an impulse buy, a gift, a second or third set for the home. A family might still gather around the big Zenith console in the living room for evening programs, but it was the little Emerson that a mother listened to while washing dishes. And it was the little Emerson that a husband turned on in the garage. They had engineered the perfect balance of cost, color, and circuitry. The product was flawless, the distribution was massive, and the American consumer was buying them by the millions. But this exact triumph created the machine that would eventually become a trap. By the time the American economy transitioned back to civilian production after World War II, the landscape of the home had fundamentally changed. The television was rapidly conquering the living room, threatening to push the massive furniture-style radio console into obsolescence. But Emerson was not fighting for the living room. They had already claimed the rest of the house. The heart of this post-war empire was the massive Emerson manufacturing plant in Jersey City, New Jersey. This was not a boutique electronics workshop. It was a sprawling, multi-story industrial fortress dedicated entirely to the mathematics of mass production. Inside, miles of conveyor belts moved stamped metal chassis past rows of thousands of American assembly workers, many of them women, who wielded hot soldering irons, connecting resistors, capacitors, and tuning coils with practiced precision. The air smelled of melting rosin, hot metal, and warm glass. Here, raw copper, plastic, and vacuum tubes were transformed into thousands of receivers every single day. Emerson's scale was staggering. They aggressively marketed themselves with a bold, uncompromising slogan, "The biggest selling little radio in the world." The numbers supported the claim. They were feeding a vast, hungry network of American retail. A single production run from the Jersey City floor would be boxed and shipped out by rail and truck, destined for the glass display cases of Macy's in New York, the crowded shelves of neighborhood hardware stores in Ohio, and the dense, text-heavy catalog pages of Sears and Montgomery Ward. But the company's greatest mid-century triumph was not just maintaining the tabletop market, it was engineering a new American habit. Emerson became a dominant force in the popularization of the clock radio, a small radio combined with an alarm clock designed specifically for the bedroom nightstand. Before this, waking up meant suffering the jarring, mechanical ringing of a wind-up bell. Emerson integrated a reliable electric timer with their proven compact tube chassis, allowing a listener to fall asleep to evening broadcasts and wake up to the morning news. This was not just a convenience. It was the acoustic architecture of the American working-class morning. In a newly built Levittown suburban home, a factory machinist would wake up at 5 a.m. not to a harsh metal bell, but to the warm, glowing tubes of an Emerson clock radio pulling in a local AM clear channel signal, like WOR in New York or WGN in Chicago. The little radio bridged the private quiet of the bedroom with the public reality of the workday. It told the family when to put the coffee on, when to warm up the car, and what coat to wear to the job site. The Emerson badge on the dial was the first thing they saw, and the local broadcaster's voice was the first thing they heard. Because these were tube radios, they generated heat and required maintenance, but they were built to be serviced. When a glass tube burned out after years of use, the owner did not throw the radio away. They pulled the dead tube from the chassis, walked down to the local Main Street pharmacy or independent radio repair shop, tested it on a public tube tester, and bought an American-made replacement. The radio went back on the nightstand, and the morning routine continued. This deep integration into daily American life gave Emerson an almost invincible aura. They were producing millions of units, defining the secondary radio market, and keeping thousands of American factory workers employed. The machine was running at absolute maximum capacity, perfectly tuned to the needs of the mid-century listener. But maintaining this immense industrial velocity required constant innovation, and the Jersey City factory was about to push the concept of the little radio to its absolute physical limit. To feed this unprecedented demand, Emerson relied on a massive, highly synchronized domestic supply chain. Trucks backed into the Jersey City loading docks around the clock, delivering spools of copper wire, boxes of tuning capacitors, sheets of stamped aluminum, and thousands of fragile glass vacuum tubes sourced from American suppliers like RCA and Sylvania. Inside the factory, the assembly lines were deafening. Thousands of American workers, many of them women who had originally entered the industrial workforce during the war, sat shoulder to shoulder under bright fluorescent lights. They wielded hot soldering irons, methodically attaching resistors and wiring harnesses to metal chassis as the belts moved continuously forward. Emerson had expanded its distribution network to over 20,000 independent American retailers. By the early 1950s, the company was manufacturing roughly 1.5 million radio receivers a year. They built rugged portable radios wrapped in faux leather for summer beach trips, sleek plastic sets for suburban dens, and heavy-duty wooden chassis for farm kitchens. The radio had transitioned completely from a piece of fine furniture to a standardized household appliance. In a bustling Sears or Montgomery Ward catalog, an Emerson radio was listed right alongside the electric toasters, the blenders, and the vacuum cleaners. When the sun went down, a teenager in a rural Ohio bedroom could turn the dial on an Emerson tabletop set and pull in a massive AM clear channel station, a powerful 50,000-watt broadcast designed to cover multiple states at night, listening to voices from Chicago or Nashville through the static. But the engineers in New Jersey were obsessed with pushing the concept of the little radio to its absolute physical limit. Long before the Japanese transistor revolutionized the market, Emerson decided to build a tube radio that could fit entirely inside a coat pocket. To do this, they turned to sub-miniature vacuum tubes, tiny, fragile glass cylinders scarcely larger than a pencil eraser, originally developed by the military for artillery proximity fuses during World War II. By carefully wiring these microscopic tubes into a densely packed printed circuit board, a flat board carrying electronic components and etched copper tracks that replaced messy, point-to-point hand wiring, Emerson created the Model 747 in 1953. It was a marvel of American engineering brute force. A commuter boarding a morning train from Newark to Manhattan could pull this radio from a heavy wool jacket, extend the thin metal antenna, and listen to a local news broadcast while moving at 60 miles an hour. The 747 required specialized, expensive batteries, and the tiny tubes still ran warm to the touch, but it proved that Emerson owned the portable radio space. This was the absolute zenith of the company's power. They had conquered the American kitchen with Catalin plastics. They had conquered the bedroom nightstand with the clock radio, and they were attempting to conquer the human pocket. The brand name was stamped on wooden shipping crates stacked high in railway cars departing New Jersey every single hour. The American working-class consumer trusted the badge completely. If it said Emerson, it meant reliable reception, fair pricing, and robust domestic manufacturing. They had mastered the delicate, labor-intensive art of the vacuum tube. They had built a sprawling industrial fortress perfectly optimized to produce millions of glass and copper circuits. But that highly specialized, deeply entrenched manufacturing ecosystem was not flexible. It was a massive, heavy machine that required immense capital and constant sales to maintain. The Abrams brothers had won the American tabletop radio war. The tragedy was that the war was already over. The threat that would tear the Jersey City factory apart would not come from a domestic rival in Philadelphia or Chicago. It would come from a microscopic piece of germanium soldered to a cheap board, arriving on cargo ships from across the Pacific. The decline of Emerson Radio did not begin with a catastrophic bankruptcy, a massive factory fire, or a sudden corporate closure. It began with a nearly invisible shift in the American retail ecosystem in the late 1950s. The first small crack appeared not on the assembly line in New Jersey, but on the glass display counters of independent Main Street electronics shops. A store owner, looking to maximize limited shelf space, quietly placed a new, unfamiliar device next to the glowing Emerson tube portables. It was a Japanese-made transistor radio. For decades, Emerson had dominated the American market by mastering the vacuum tube. But the vacuum tube, a fragile glass envelope requiring high voltage and generating continuous heat, was fundamentally limited. The transistor, a tiny, solid-state semiconductor that amplified electrical signals using minimal power and generating almost no heat, rewrote the physical laws of radio design. Suddenly, a radio did not need a heavy power transformer or a bulky battery pack. It did not need ventilation slots cut into a Catalin plastic cabinet to prevent melting. It could be slipped into a shirt pocket, dropped on a desk, and played for weeks on a single cheap battery. At first, many American radio executives dismissed the early Asian imports. The early Japanese sets often sounded tinny. Their small loudspeakers, the paper cones that physically push air to create sound, lacked the warm, resonant bass of a 5-tube Emerson tabletop set. But the American teenager in 1958 did not care about acoustic warmth or audio fidelity. They cared about mobility. When a high school student walked into a local hardware store or a Sears catalog showroom, they faced a stark choice: an American-made tube portable that required expensive replacement batteries and a heavy carrying case, or a sleek imported pocket transistor that cost a fraction of the price and could be smuggled into a study hall or taken to the beach. The choice was immediate, and it was devastating to the domestic industry. This was the brutal reality of Force 4: imports, private labels, and good enough listening. The American consumer, whom Emerson had specifically trained to view the radio as a cheap, disposable impulse buy rather than a lifelong piece of furniture, no longer cared where the radio was built. They only cared that it played the local top 40 station clearly enough to hear the latest rock and roll record. Emerson was caught in a lethal paradox. The very strategy that had made them an empire, selling massive volumes of inexpensive radios to the working class, was now being weaponized against them by foreign manufacturers who could do it even cheaper. To fight back, Emerson attempted a rapid transition to solid-state manufacturing. They introduced their own American-made transistor radios, proudly stamping them with the Jersey City origin. But here, the company ran headfirst into Force 1: American cabinet, tube, component, and labor costs. The mathematics of the New Jersey factory no longer worked. The sprawling multi-story plant, the unionized assembly lines, and the domestic supply chain of copper, stamped aluminum, and early printed circuit boards, flat boards carrying electronic components, and etched copper tracks that replaced point-to-point wiring, were impossibly expensive compared to the heavily subsidized electronics industry emerging in post-war Japan. Even when Emerson engineered a brilliant solid-state receiver, they simply could not build it in America and sell it at a price that matched the imports. The profit margin, always razor-thin in the little radio business, evaporated completely. The Jersey City factory, once the undisputed engine of the company's glory, rapidly transformed into a crushing financial liability. The massive conveyor belts that had once been a symbol of American industrial might now felt like a desperate treadmill. The factory had to produce tens of thousands of units a week just to cover basic overhead. But the retail buyers, from the massive department stores down to the local pharmacies, were increasingly allocating their shelf space to cheaper overseas brands like Sony and Panasonic. As the 1960s progressed, the retail environment itself became more hostile. The traditional independent radio dealer, a person who could explain the robust engineering of an American chassis to a customer, was slowly being replaced by the big box discount store. In these new retail warehouses, radios were sold in plastic blister packs or stacked in giant cardboard bins. Nobody was there to explain American engineering heritage. The customer was only looking at the price tag. Emerson engineers tried to adapt, experimenting with hybrid chassis that mixed tubes and transistors to keep costs down. But it was a losing battle against offshore efficiency. The Abrams brothers, who had saved the company during the Great Depression by understanding exactly what the American family could afford, realized that the domestic manufacturing model was breaking apart. The Jersey City factory was still stamping out cabinets and soldering chassis, but the American working-class consumer had already found a cheaper voice. The foundation was cracked, and the final collapse was only a signature away. By the middle of the 1960s, the Abrams brothers, who had steered the company through the Great Depression, World War II, and the post-war boom, recognized that the American manufacturing equation was permanently broken. The massive Jersey City plant was operating on a dangerous edge. The cost of American labor, steel, copper, and glass was steadily rising, while the retail price of a tabletop radio was artificially pinned to the floor by the relentless flood of foreign imports. The machine could not sustain itself. In 1966, the family that had guided Emerson since the phonograph era made a fateful decision to step away. They sold the company to the National Union Electric Corporation. It was a staggering corporate shift. A pioneering American radio manufacturer was absorbed by a diversified conglomerate, best known for making Eureka vacuum cleaners. The new corporate parent attempted to streamline operations and update the product line, but the structural market forces were too massive to reverse. The American listener was fragmenting. For the high-end consumer, the market had shifted toward the stereo receiver, a home audio component that combines a radio tuner, amplifier, and input switching in one unit. These listeners wanted massive, silver-faced hi-fi systems to play FM stereo and vinyl records, not small plastic AM boxes. Meanwhile, the low-end market belonged entirely to cheap, imported pocket transistors. Emerson was trapped in the shrinking middle. They were too expensive to compete with the Hong Kong imports, and they lacked the audiophile prestige required to compete with high-end Japanese and American stereo brands. This intense financial pressure fractured the relationship between the manufacturer and the repair bench. For decades, the local Main Street electronics shop was supported by a vast service network, the shops, technicians, and repair counters that kept radios working long after the initial sale. An older Emerson tube radio was a physical investment, built with standard American parts that a local technician could easily source and replace. But as the company desperately cut costs under corporate ownership in the late 1960s, the radios became cheaper, flimsier, and harder to fix. When a cheap solid-state component failed on a newly discounted set, the local repairman often told the customer that fixing the radio would cost more than simply buying a new one. The American repair culture was actively being starved out, replaced by a disposable, good enough listening culture. By 1973, National Union Electric decided they could no longer bleed cash on domestic electronics manufacturing. They sold the Emerson brand name and its marketing rights to Major Electronics, a Brooklyn-based company that explicitly specialized in importing inexpensive audio equipment from Asia. This transaction was the fatal blow. It completely severed the historic brand from its engineering soul. Major Electronics did not want the sprawling, expensive American manufacturing infrastructure. They did not need thousands of skilled New Jersey assembly workers. They only wanted the consumer trust associated with the badge. The inevitable consequence arrived swiftly. The massive Jersey City factory, the very building that had pumped out millions of Catalin radios and clock radios to define the American morning, was shut down. The assembly lines stopped moving. The tools were sold. The deep institutional knowledge of mass-market circuit design evaporated into the local economy. Thousands of American workers lost their jobs, and an entire ecosystem of domestic component suppliers lost one of their largest buyers. What followed was a textbook: ruthless execution of brand dilution, the weakening of a brand when its name appears on products that no longer match the original identity. The Emerson name was immediately transformed into a hollow licensing badge. A working-class consumer could walk into a new big-box discount department store in 1978 and buy an Emerson-branded cassette boombox, a portable television, or a plastic digital clock radio. In the 1980s, the badge was slapped onto imported turntables, VCRs, and microwave ovens. The customer would see the logo, remember the reliable tube radio their mother kept in the kitchen, and assume they were buying the same American quality. But these new products had never been touched by an Emerson engineer. They were generic, off-the-shelf electronics manufactured in overseas factories, shipped across the Pacific on cargo freighters, and stamped with the familiar name at the last possible moment. The American consumer was paying for a memory. The radio receiver was no longer a promise of reception. It was merely a retail illusion. The sacred agreement between the factory, the physical dial, and the listener was permanently broken. The Jersey City lines stopped. The factory doors locked. The engineers went home. The service manuals disappeared. The brand name survived. The radio inside was gone. The badge became a sticker. The local shop closed. The American dial was empty. The market had moved on. If you walk down the brightly lit aisle of a modern American discount chain or browse a massive online retail platform today, you will still find the Emerson name, but the trademark is entirely hollow. After the 1970s, the brand was passed between various corporate holding companies, eventually ending up as a licensed badge managed by massive overseas conglomerates. Today, the Emerson logo is silk-screened onto cheap plastic alarm clocks, generic microwave ovens, and disposable Bluetooth speakers that are manufactured entirely by third-party factories in Asia. The company does not employ American radio engineers. It does not operate a sprawling domestic assembly line. It exists purely as a marketing asset, a familiar arrangement of letters designed to give an imported, off-the-shelf product a thin, deceptive veneer of legacy trust. But far outside the big box discount aisles, the true legacy of the company is fiercely protected by a dedicated American preservation community. At estate sales in the Midwest, at crowded vintage electronics swap meets, and across specialized online antique radio forums, the original Emerson tube radios are treated with profound reverence. A 1930s Model 25 Pee-wee, a rare Mickey Mouse repoussé set, or a 1940 Catalin Emerson Patriot is not viewed as obsolete junk. To a vintage radio restorer, a broadcast historian, or an industrial design collector, these sets are masterful, tangible examples of American problem-solving. The original Emerson matters today because it represents a radically different philosophy of consumer electronics. When a modern collector places an 80-year-old Emerson chassis on a wooden repair bench, they are interacting with a machine that was explicitly designed to be understood and fixed. They can heat up a soldering iron, replace dried-out wax paper capacitors, components that store and release electrical energy in a circuit, and swap out a dead glass vacuum tube for a new old-stock replacement. When they turn the heavy bakelite volume control and the tubes begin to warm up, the radio does exactly what it was engineered to do decades ago. It pulls a faint AM broadcast signal out of the static and fills the room with rich, resonant sound. It is not a disposable object. It is a permanent, repairable bridge to the airwaves. The physical footprint of that original engineering empire, however, has been almost entirely erased from the American landscape. The massive manufacturing plant in Jersey City, New Jersey, where thousands of local workers once soldered intricate circuits and molded early plastics by the hour, no longer produces electronics. Like many of the grand American radio factories of the mid-20th century, the industrial spaces that define the working-class economy have been hollowed out, demolished, or heavily gentrified. They have been transformed from loud, hot engines of domestic manufacturing into quiet, high-priced residential lofts or generic warehousing. The local Main Street shops that originally sold those radios have been replaced by corporate chain stores, and the independent technicians who fix them have long since packed up their tools. Yet, there is a brilliant, surprising footnote to the Emerson story that defies its tragic industrial end. The Emerson Patriot, The compact Catalin plastic radio designed by Norman Bell Geddes in 1940 to sit safely on a crowded kitchen counter or a modest bedside table did not just survive in the hands of amateur hobbyists. Today, that exact radio receiver sits securely behind glass in the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. A device engineered to be the cheapest, most accessible working-class appliance in America is now universally recognized as a breathtaking masterpiece of 20th century industrial art. The evidence left behind by the Abrams brothers and their Jersey City factory suggests a harsh reality about the American consumer market. Emerson did not collapse because their engineers forgot how to build a reliable radio. They did not fail because the American public stopped listening to the AM or FM dial. They fell because the structural market forces shifted from valuing domestic labor, repairable engineering, and physical beauty to demanding absolute retail cheapness above all else. The system rewarded massive manufacturing scale until scale was no longer enough to survive, and then the system simply rewarded the cheapest possible import. The American retail market kept the badge because it needed the illusion of familiar trust, but it ruthlessly abandoned the factory that actually earned it. Somewhere in a quiet suburban basement, an original 1940s Emerson Catalin radio sits on a wooden shelf, its heavy tubes glowing warm in the dim light, waiting for a hand to turn the dial and pull one more distant voice from the American night. See you in the next one.